Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Alinka Drondo, and I'm an intern at the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here at UMass Boston, as well as everyone who is joining on Zoom. For those on Zoom, the chat is on now, and we'd love to have you introduce yourselves, and it will come back on near the end. During and immediately after the talk, please put your Q&As in the Zoom Q&A function. And when you leave the Zoom, a very short survey will pop up and would be very grateful if you could take a moment to fill it out. And then those in the room have a form on desks, as well as the Q&A, or the QR code on the screen that will come back up towards the end, and would likewise really appreciate it if you just take a couple of minutes to leave some feedback for us. Before introducing today's speaker, I want to open by situating us in this place, UMass Boston, which was built on the unceded homelands of the Indigenous Massachusetts people, and by honoring the diverse Indigenous peoples' enduring relationships with their traditional territories, and by foregrounding the way that land passed from Indigenous to non-Indigenous control is through a violent history of genocide and forced removal, and the death, dispossession, and displacement of countless people and communities, all processes which remain ongoing today. I'd also like to emphasize that land acknowledgements by themselves are just a small beginning in addressing this history and present so riddled with injustice. They need to be followed by other forms of solidarity and action. Our event today is the sixth and final talk in a 2-semester-long speaker series on climate breakdown and the war system that the Consortium has organized in collaboration with the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, with support from an affirming multivocal humanities grant from the Mellon Foundation. So would first like to extend warm thanks to the department and to Dr. Amani El-Jack for this enduring collaboration. We also want to thank the large number of departments, programs, centers, and offices at UMass Boston who are co-sponsoring this series. You can see them all on screen. Their support is absolutely essential in enabling us to bring these speakers to you. Our thanks go to the many wonderful Consortium interns, UMass students, and staff volunteers, and the Consortium Program Associate Claire Kendrick, who have played vital roles in preparing for and running these speaker events. And finally, I want to express my profound appreciation to the Consortium's director, Carol Cohn, with whom I've been so honored to collaborate in conceptualizing and organizing the series. Thank you for everything, Carol. So now, 2 minutes about the series. In the second semester of this year's series on climate breakdown and the war system, our focus is on militaries, policing, AI, and struggles for justice. At the most recent talk, we learned about the vast ecological impacts of natural resource extraction required for US militaries and policing, including for so-called green technologies. The same can be said for artificial intelligence, as we consider the immense carbon emissions from powering data centers, as well as the rare earth minerals that go into manufacturing hardware. According to the International Energy Agency, only one AI data center consumes as much electricity as 100,000 households, creating heat islands that warm up surrounding land by up to 16 degrees Fahrenheit. Across the US, more than 2/3 of data centers are located in water-scarce regions, where each one consumes up to 300,000 gallons of water a day. That's enough to supply 1,000 households. For the communities living in the vicinity of data centers, electricity prices have gone up as much as 267% in the last 5 years. Air quality has worsened. Taps have gone dry. These harms fall disproportionately on communities already at the forefront of climate crisis impacts. This increasing use of AI by the war system is particularly alarming. Just last week, the US military announced the launch of an Army Data Operations Center designed to, quote, transform how the Army manages and uses its vast data resources to ensure decision dominance on the modern battlefield, end quote. The Pentagon reportedly used AI to generate hundreds of recommendations for targets in recent US attacks on Iran, while the Israeli Defense Forces have long used AI to compile data gathered through mass surveillance to inform military targeting in Gaza and in southern Lebanon, according to the Associated Press. And at this convergence of climate crisis and extraction, rising AI usage, and ongoing military attacks on civilians is the exploitation of Indigenous lands and the targeting of Indigenous peoples. And so, in the context of these intertwined and unfolding crises, today we are very honored to have Janene Yazzie with us. Janene Yazzie is an internationally known Indigenous rights and human rights advocate and a longtime community organizer from the Navajo Nation. With a background in international politics and human rights, she has 21 years of experience working on the intersections of Indigenous peoples' rights, climate change and justice, water and food sovereignty, sustainable development, renewable energy, and the protection of human rights defenders. In 2013, she co-founded the largest community-led watershed restoration project on the Navajo Nation, the Little Colorado River Watershed Chapters Association. From 2017 to 2019, she represented the International Indian Treaty Council as the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development, a constituency of the high-level political forum on the Sustainable Development Goals. She helped the IPMG co-found the Right Energy Partnership, an international Indigenous-led initiative for renewable energy. In 2020, she helped start one of the largest and most successful mutual aid campaigns on the Navajo Nation, the Navajo and Hopi Families COVID-19 Relief Fund, and she served as the lead New Mexico coordinator of the network. In 2021, she received the International Indigenous Leadership Award from the Alnoba Lewis Family Foundation. Janene is currently the North America representative to the Facilitative Working Group of the Local Communities Indigenous Peoples, a constituted body of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which she is also co-chairing for 2025 to 2026. She was recognized this year as one of 8 2026 to 2028 Red Natural History Fellows. Her current work includes developing political education tools and organizing strategies for climate justice, with a specialty in addressing the nexus of climate change, militarism, AI, and Indigenous peoples' rights. She is the director of global programs for the Woven Project, a global Indigenous-led climate justice network. So now please join me in giving Janene a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you all for taking time out of your day to come here and share space with me. And thank you especially to Carol, who I've known for many years and have always admired the work that you've done and just the vision that you've created that has allowed this opportunity here today. Yat shea Janene Yazzie and shea tina Janene shle do torachini bashishtin netlana dashiche do dilgai dashinala. I want to, continue this practice that people have picked up in recent years in doing land acknowledgements, and thank the Massachusetts people and the Wampanoag and Narragansett and all of the other surrounding Indigenous nations and advocates that continue to call this area and this region their homelands. It's been very different growing up in a time where my experience as a student and as an individual and Indigenous woman in different spaces have often confronted questions and shock and awe that Indigenous people still exist, to this practice of people picking up and acknowledging land and where they're at. And I love it. And also, let's keep going forward, right? Aside from like the bio that was read out, my work has always been deeply rooted in just my experience being an Indigenous woman and growing up on a reservation and loving and caring for the family and community that I was a part of, and being motivated to contribute and address just systemic inequalities that continue to hold our people down and to plague and prohibit us from achieving a quality of life that I know all of our loved ones deserve. That background is in growing up in communities impacted by the legacy of uranium mining, and most particularly the 1979 Church Rock uranium mill tilling spill, and just the way that devastated our local economies and have created these public health issues that my families, myself, my loved ones have to deal with. I also grew up in a region that is at the epicenter of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. And that has also been defined by grassroots advocacy to address the impacts of cumulative exposures and legacies of contamination from all sorts of extractive industries. And so I don't really see this as a work or job related activity, but as a continuance of the responsibility to address these systemic harms and to remind people that despite some of these overwhelming histories and realities, we still have a lot of power at our hands. Let's see if I can get these slides to work. To begin my discussion today, I really want to take some time, even though I know that there's been a lot of great work in building up the framework and deepening our collective understanding about many of the root causes of the systems that we're dealing with. I wanted to take some time to clarify some of the terms in the framework I'll be using as I talk about, oh, what did you press? Okay, I think maybe my book probably pressed something else. Okay, thank you so much. Because like my core intention is to share my belief that understanding the Indigenous peoples' movement and histories of resistance is informative for the moment that we find ourselves in. I have seen in my own movement organizing and advocacy just this increase in the sense of being overwhelmed by everything that is happening around us. And it's understandable. Many of our communities, our peoples, our loved ones find themselves feeling under attack because of what's happening in our worlds. And many are grappling with a sense of hopelessness and powerlessness about what we can do to stop it. I feel like much of that comes from our lack of understanding of the root causes and the ways that power structures have been built in this country and around the globe. And so I often reference settler colonialism as one of those root causes, and needing to unpack what that means is always a necessity, because we can't take for granted that a lot of people have had access to that, even in my own communities. And I don't say that even with the assumption that Indigenous peoples all use that framework when talking about the issues that we're dealing with in our communities. I mean, I grew up poor. I grew up and was a first generation college student in my family. And so needing to unpack and further explain with my own people why these frameworks are important for understanding what we're dealing with in our homes has always been an important part of the work. And so with settler colonialism, what I'm talking about and referring is really the goal of removing and erasing Indigenous peoples as a continuance of the settler colonial logic to take land and resources and power from Indigenous peoples. Historically, this was outright genocide, and in many cases, from our experience with the legacies of contamination and the disempowerment and the forced removal of Indigenous peoples, we argue that that genocide has never really stopped. It has just changed forms. And like one of the realities is that we need to understand what settler colonialism, because the United States wouldn't exist without it. And this affects all of us. We're not talking about just the historic waves of European populations that came here, but even everyone that calls these states homes. We are all indoctrinated and conditioned under settler colonial systems, and that has a real impact in normalizing a lot of values that really are at the core of perpetuating many of the injustices that we deal with today. And so we, as Indigenous advocates, we're constantly having, before we can even get to what we are fighting for, having to do a lot of this intellectual and emotional labor of explaining these things. Not to place blame or to like compete in some sort of oppression Olympics, which we see in much of our movements, but to help everyone understand that we're all needing to step into this responsibility of recognizing the structures around us, our role in it, and how we have all been enlisted, whether we know it or not, in perpetuating a lot of these systemic inequalities. And the data has shown that it's been very successful. Despite a lot of the attention and visibility that has been made to Indigenous rights movements in recent years, there is still a large part of our population that doesn't believe Indigenous people still exists. And that, creates its own barriers for our advocacy and what we're fighting for. Settler colonialism and racism, they're connected and codependent, but they're not the same thing. And our responses, the way that our movements are developed, become informed by these differences. I talk often when we try to reclaim our movement histories about the difference between the fight for Indigenous self-determination and the fight for civil rights. On our fight for self-determination is very much defined by trying to maintain the ability and the right to carry on and perpetuate our unique worldviews and the solutions that are rooted in it. And this has always been seen as a threat to the power structures that exist. And so I should have closed my book. I did send to the conference organizers a recommendation for a book. There's several books, but this one in particular, I think, provides a very helpful analysis of the connection between policing, militarism, and the surveillance of Indigenous movements. It's focused on Canada, but it is relevant and similar across all settler states, particularly the United States. And it does a great job of showing and bringing visibility to Indigenous rights movements that have really exposed how the use of state apparatuses to surveil, delegitimize, and criminalize Indigenous peoples has been applied to any resistance and any pushback against state and private interests. And so we know and have brought this to conversations about abolition and trying to think about alternatives to police states, that these institutions were developed to enforce settler colonialism as a project. And we've also experienced for many generations in our movement and our organizing, just the enormous capacity of the police state to surveil and collect data and information on our movements and our movement leaders, and the ways that those have led to increased partnerships between private actors, corporations, and state law enforcement and government officials to create the situations that we're dealing with today. And so what this normalization of national security practices has a direct impact into our ability to organize our resistance. And we're seeing, as Indigenous peoples, at every level of advocacy that we've been doing, we've been trying to raise the alarm of these realities, trying to bring attention to the disappearance of our peoples, the over-criminalization of our leaders. And a lot of times we were met with just disbelief that anything like that could happen in a democracy like the United States. We are the pinnacle of what it means to have fair and just societies and just legal systems. Now, I think we're at a point where people are finally questioning that and realizing that that is not necessarily the reality, but for many people, they're describing what we're experiencing now as a new phenomenon, because it is just now impacting people beyond the original targets. And so this history of having our resistance and our movement leaders classified as threats to national security has always been a core aspect and a core challenge to our struggles for self-determination. And we're seeing an explosion now in that surveillance and in that policing of our movements with the advancement of the capacities of our state to be able to collect data and to analyze it in real time using AI technologies and the expansion of all of the infrastructure to support it. But regardless of that, and in spite of that, in spite of the erasure of what we are dealing with and what we are fighting for, we have continued to persist. Um, and our continued persistence and success is a lesson that settler colonialism is not over and it is not done. And resistance to its ongoing practices is not only possible, but it's necessary, not just for us as Indigenous peoples, but for all of us and for all of life. And when I enter into spaces with newly activated people, like for example, a lot of the people who have been activated by the No Kings protests and are going into the street and trying to participating in these marches, because they are now recognizing that there's something seriously wrong. It becomes very important to have these conversations and to bring these perspectives in, because I've learned from that experience that their only understanding of Indigenous resistance is that it's violent, that we want to go back to an old way of living that is no longer possible, that we're anti-progress, we're anti-technology. And in that is a lot of assumptions that we're anti like progressive civilization. And those become really harmful when people don't reflect and actually deconstruct those biases and assumptions. But it's not just in non-Indigenous populations, it's also within our own communities, because internalized colonization has a real impact. So this isn't like like trying to pit all the responsibility on non-Indigenous peoples to do this work. It's an invitation to join us in doing that work together. And that becomes important because in that way, then we start to understand that the resistance is not the core thing of what we are trying to do. It's what we're trying to build and what we have successfully managed to preserve despite all of the forces that have existed throughout time to wipe us, our language, our culture, our ceremonies, our governance systems, and our ways of life off the face of the earth. And some like just, I wish I could spend this entire time really delving into just the beauty of what those solutions and those models are and how it's informed our advocacy, not only for enriching conversations and development of human rights frameworks, but for informing and raising the alarm about the cumulative impacts of extractive industries, informing and raising the alarm and advocacy to take seriously the realities of climate change and man-made climate change and the impacts that it's having in our communities and the vulnerabilities that it's creating, and as well as the solutions that are possible as a result of it. The ability for us to right now radically transform our food systems in a way that it addresses many of these complex issues that we are dealing with, while also building the foundation for us to access healthy food, sustainable food, and food that actually restores biological diversity in our communities. I also think about the ways that has informed frameworks for building regenerative economies as an alternative to corporate capitalism and extractivist models. We are not trying to imagine something that is impossible. We are trying to share solutions that have persisted despite the challenges that we have faced. A lot of the ways that we have resisted has been rooted in nonviolence, because the simple reality, we do not control a lot of the mechanisms of violence. And it's never the intention to fight fire with fire. That is just not our ways and not the core aspect of our belief system. And I think that that's not, I often feel like when we talk about nonviolence and the ways that Indigenous peoples resist rooted in ceremony, a lot of people like they have sympathy for that and empathy for that. But it often feels like there's an assumption that we are naive, that's actually never going to change anything. And the reality is that it already has, that we've already made progress despite the overwhelming challenges that we face. And a lot of that it comes from rooting ourselves in our values and in our ceremonies, allows us to maintain a holistic perspective of what it is we are fighting for and a clearer vision of what it is we are fighting against. And that is ultimately, I think, the core value that learning about and understanding Indigenous resistance has to inform everything that we are confronting today. Our survival is not accidental, it's instructive. And there's a lot of things that can be shared and replicated from learning from those things. Because it is insane. It is insane that we can sit in one of the most developed countries in the world where we do have a lot of freedoms as civil society. And we are accepting and have normalized that fighting and protection of clean water and clean air, fighting and protection of sacred life forms is criminal and can be classified as domestic terrorism. But that is the reality that we have faced even before this new rise of authoritarianism, even before we've had this person in office. This is something that we have been confronted with even under the historic leadership of our first Black president, because we're fighting structures and systems of power that benefit a particular predatory class that is not just reducible to one person or one party in the system. And that's why starting with a framework of understanding settler colonialism becomes so informative and necessary in order to understand what it is that we are doing and fighting for. If you haven't learned about Standing Rock, if you haven't learned about Line 3 battles, if you haven't learned about a lot of these forms of resistance that are ongoing in Indigenous lands and territories, I strongly encourage that you do. And start with wherever you're located, wherever you're from, and finding out what those battles are there, because I guarantee you they exist. And I invite you to do that because of the reality, and I know from the previous discussions, this has probably already been brought to your attention. What we're dealing with now with the expansion of militarism, the building of detention centers, and the expansion of AI infrastructure and data centers is going to and has already accelerated many of those battles. 50%, like globally, more than 50% of the critical mineral resources that are being used and targeted for these technologies are on Indigenous lands. In the United States, it's more than 70%. And in many of these cases, that is on top of the already existing injustices and resource extraction that has created the conditions of utilizing Indigenous territories as resource colonies. And the ways that fossil fuel development is also being brought back into the table at the same time that this infrastructure is being rolled out under the framework of AI for good and AI for climate change. So much of that infrastructure is reigniting the push for coal development, the expansion of oil and gas, as well as expansion of mining for critical minerals. And we know from Standing Rock, we know from these ongoing battles, we know from Line 3, that any time we dare to stand in defense of these projects because we're trying to protect the well-being of our peoples and our communities, because we're trying to protect clean water and access to clean air for current and future generations, we will be met with systemic, militarized violence by private and by police forces. And it's only getting worse. Now, it's no longer Indigenous peoples being targeted. Now, like with the new framework that came out with the National Security Presidential Memorandum that was passed, a lot of us are now falling under that category. And it's like, humor is a huge part of our resistance and our like sustaining our ongoing battle in the face of being overwhelmed and tired of fighting. But I've been finding a lot of joy recently with all the problems that may be with all the people that are newly activated and doing like symbolic protests of people like recognizing, especially older white men, that suddenly their values and their beliefs and how they're understanding the world makes them a domestic terrorist. And to see just that realization and that like that transformation happen in real time, it does bring a little bit of joy to my heart. I'm not gonna lie. Um, and so, uh, in all acts of repression, and I know there's been a lot of significant and very brilliant studies on this. It's been recognized that the intention is to overwhelm and create chaos and to create division. But it's also been recognized that in the activities and the actions that get carried out, there are always these openings of that allow new connections to be made, that allow new conversations to be had, that break us out of some of these silos of our movements. And I know like before a lot of these things were happening, our movements were struggling and for climate justice. And how do we bring more people into this space? How do we build better relationships with the climate justice, with the anti-war, with the civil rights, with the gender justice groups? How do we better bring our resistance together? Because a lot of us were operating in silos. And that's one of the opportunities that's been created with everything that we've been dealing with today, is that we're creating new opportunities to bring our movement strategies and logics together because everyone is recognizing that we're all under attack. And we're understanding in a deeper way that our success and our ability to move through these attacks and protect our communities depend on us being there for each other. And so for Indigenous peoples, recognizing that and mobilizing and working through both the limitations and opportunities that are sometimes created by state apparatuses, we have always operated and developed our advocacy to engage at every level of governance. This is part of both a responsibility that's been put upon us to exhaust all domestic remedies before we can bring attention to the systemic treaty violations and land theft and resource theft that we continue to deal with. But it was also a motivation to restore our pre-colonial connections and relationships with each other across our territories. Despite what many people have been led to believe through the erasure of Indigenous histories, our networks and our connections with one another as Indigenous peoples expanded entire continents and oceans. And returning back to that level of connectivity and understanding, both in our politics and also in our resistance, has become more and more necessary and has become a beautiful way to remind us that we don't have to define the possibilities of achieving justice or creating better alternatives within the state apparatus. We can actually define and build alternatives and resistance that exist, that operate outside of those limitations. And that's been a core part of Indigenous rights at the international level, is that we develop language and a framework that we've been successfully utilizing in our climate change advocacy and addressing the criminalization of human rights and land rights defenders, and in all of these other issues, rooted in the fact that despite our diversity, despite the differences in languages and experiences with different types of colonialism, that we find our connectivity and our purpose, our shared sense of purpose, and restoring our relationship with Mother Earth. And that's enough. That's enough to help us then build the strategies and the collective power that is necessary to respond to the systems that we are dealing with now. And it's been having impacts. It's been having impacts both within the systems and in informing strategies outside that we can continue to build off of. This is just one example, because I remember when this came out last year, there was still a lot of people who were shocked that an official UN document was created that's talking about defossilizing our economies and that in many ways could be interpreted as being anti-capitalist because of the logics that it's promoting. But the argument and the research in this is sound. I took a few excerpts out because I loved this line. These scientific findings align with Indigenous peoples' assessments, calling for the banning of all exploration and exploitation of oil, tar sands, oil, shale gas, coal, and natural gas, including transportation infrastructure development by 2030. I love also this is necessary to prevent further intergenerational human rights harms, as climate actions implemented in this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. And these small acknowledgments, like in the grand scheme of things, they are small. It's a small win, small progress. It's an opening. It's an opening for us to then create shared language and shared strategies, and to understand how and why we must work together to challenge at every level the activities and actions that are being carried out by the states, because those that are invested in the expansion of mining of critical minerals and the expansion of military operations, those that are going to profit off of the development of detention centers, the further criminalization of our peoples, the projects that benefit from those types of structures and policies, and the wealth that is generated from it, they are also in these spaces working to create the conditions to allow them to do that with little to no resistance. And so the fact that we can show up and at every level of government and protect our communities, safeguard our fundamental rights, allows us to make sure that we still have an opportunity to preserve our lifeways and our worldviews that are deeply rooted in informing the necessary alternatives that we need. This is one of the recent documents that is a culmination of the advocacy that has happened at that level, and the work that has been done to advance Indigenous peoples' perspectives and worldviews and informing some of these larger frameworks that have been adopted and taken up in policy and advocacy by states and by other grassroots groups. And it just goes to show how we're not going to preemptively give up on this battle for our rights because we're suddenly feeling overwhelmed. And that we're not going to give in to normalizing how these structures and institutions are built on unjust logic from the beginning. And we do that because there's still a strong core belief and hope that humanity is going to wake up and is going to want to invest in and to remember that we all have the collective capacity to build better ways. And so when it comes to the expansion and rollout of AI and data centers and militarization of our police forces, like I said, we have been firsthand experiencing the acceleration of these practices in our movements even before this administration. So much of the speed and efficacy that a lot of this has been able to take place in the last 2 years comes because it is built off of the privatization and the theft of land and resources that was already being carried out prior to this administration. It is also accelerated and informed just by the fact that the system is not suddenly broken. It's not suddenly being corrupted to give these actors advantage over our rights and pursuing their goals, but because it is working exactly how it was structured to work. We're not dealing with a sudden loss of democracy. We're not dealing with a sudden rise of authoritarianism. We are dealing with the legacies of it. It's just that now more people are targeted and directly impacted by it. But it's not inevitable. Just as in our experience and in our movements and in our ongoing resistance, we understand and know that the trajectory of these systems, that these plans that have been put in place, that these economies have been built upon, just as we have always known that they are inherently unsustainable, that they will eventually reach a point where it's no longer able to carry out its destruction. It's the same thing with this. We are already raising alarms that just the energy needs and consumptions of these data centers was going to be unsustainable and was going to start to disproportionately impact those that were already systemically vulnerable under these systems. Like we know that many of the data centers are sited on our near poor Black and people of color neighborhoods, and are also on our near Indigenous lands and territories. We also knew that the push to accelerate this development was going to then impact other communities and peoples that have been, to this point, kind of protected and privileged, despite these realities. And it's coming to a head. I mean, the way that the investments are being made, the unsustainability of the economic structures and how those investments are being played out, and the real resource limitations that are all affecting the building out of this infrastructure. But we also must be proactive in preventing it. Indigenous lands and territories and movements are going to be those front lines by which we can all engage in to do that. And it's not just about resisting, right? Those are also sites of building the alternatives. Because as much as, and I know how gross like the ads and a lot of the mainstream narrative can be. I've been seeing a lot of it. It's like everywhere, right? It's just like selling this idea of just this like advanced technological society that's suddenly going to solve all of our problems, right? Everyone's happy and frolicking in the green fields by the data centers. And it's so insane to me that they're still trying to like utilize those types of frameworks to sell these ideas to people. The reality is that they have been met with a lot more resistance than they anticipated. And that is a testament to the success that we have had as people in our movements and in our resistance and in deepening our understanding and our collective consciousness of the root causes of these things. And I love that. And different of our movement in our different movement spaces, as we're talking about what does it look like, what does resistance and our mobilization look like in the next 5 to 10 years, there's still an opportunity to address the gap in the visibility of Indigenous resistance and movements that can help us get there and imagine a better future and what's possible for us. And that it comes down to such simple truth. I feel like some of the difficulty in engaging in a lot of this work and in building this collective power is the simplicity of the message. Like meeting all of this overwhelming violence and what's happening in our communities and the fear that it's creating with love and with a commitment to restore our responsibility to one another, to be good relatives to one another. Like, that's been the core of Indigenous resistance. And we see that playing out in many of the places where some of the most horrendous and atrocious forms of genocide and extermination are being carried out. It is not successful and eradicating our will to live and to fight for a better life. And that is the core of our power. Being a good relative, that is at the core of what we are trying to do as Indigenous peoples and to help contribute to our collective imagination that justice is not something that will achieve by us, incrementally fixing these structures that are fundamentally rooted in preserving and protecting the monopolization of wealth and power, not for any of us in this room, but for those who have historically built their wealth and power on these systems. But justice is restoring wholeness to ourselves, to our communities, to our ecosystems, to our relationships to one another, to our consciousness and our understanding that we don't belong to our militaries, we don't belong to our states, we don't belong to our jobs, we belong to Mother Earth. And we are inextricably dependent upon her health and well-being. Peace is found in upholding that responsibility to protect the whole and remembering and being disciplined in all of our strategies that we are all connected to each other, and that's our responsibility to ensure that in our activities and our visions that we are protecting all of sacred life. In this way, may we reroot ourselves in our resistance and learn from indigenous movements that exist everywhere, all across this globe, that we can fight these corporations and we can fight these states, and we can do this in a way that restores our relationships to one another and that centers a commitment to build structures of care that protect our most vulnerable. There's so many different allegories and lessons from different indigenous peoples around this, but one I find that resonates with a lot of people here is like just the actions of the buffalo. When a big storm comes across these prairies, the buffalo circle up and they pit in the center of their circle their most vulnerable, their children, the youth, the young, and their elderly. And all genders of the buffalo that are strong and able-bodied stand in defense and surround them to protect them. I also have been seeing a lot of people looking to the behaviors and social structures of whales and remembering that many parts of the animal kingdom are structured around matriarchy and matrilineal systems of social order. And we don't have to look to the animals to do that. You can also learn that from indigenous peoples, I'm just saying. but so much of our advocacy against these overwhelming structures of oppression are rooted in just those basic truths. We have a right and responsibility to be good relatives. Part of an effective strategy is to restore the sacred matriarchy and our remembrance that we are all children of Mother Earth. And the signs of a healthy society and healthy systems of economy and decision making are when we are effectively centering the well-being of our most vulnerable in our communities. And so the invitation is there, the gifts are there, the wisdom is there, the models and the alternatives are there to inform each and every one of us that we have a role to play in resisting the rise of authoritarianism, the expansion and strengthening of supremacist structures of violence, and in being better able to question and analyze what is being done right now with the rollout of AI technologies and data centers. And we have to do it, because if we don't, we are preemptively giving away our power to agendas that do not serve us. And we don't have to. This is not an inevitable trajectory of our collective society. There are alternatives that exist, and there are ways to address and to build our power, even though it feels like everything that we have achieved so far has been taken away. And a lot of people feel like the legs have been cut out from under our movement. It's not true, because those movements got to where they were not having the legs in the first place, not having resources, not having money, not having political support. Like, let's not forget where we came from and what is possible when we recognize that nothing they have done right now has fundamentally taken that power away from us. And I'll stop there, because if I keep going on another point, I'm going to go past my time.
Thank you so much, Janine, for everything you shared with us. We now have about 25 minutes until the end of our event for discussion, and we would really love to invite questions from both people in the room and for those of you attending on Zoom. Please submit yours through the Zoom Q&A function. We'll take maybe multiple questions at a time, 2 or 3.
We have a question back here.
Oh, perfect.
Perfect. Thank you so much for this talk. Mainly because it's so convenient, mainly because me and my sisters, we talk a lot about, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. My sisters and I were talking about Native Americans and Indigenous people, and their like what's going on with them. And then my sisters were like, oh, like a lot of them receive like free healthcare and free things sometimes, And I'm like, yeah, but like still, I remember in high school reading the book about that something about I forgot his name, but it was about a Native American who lived in the reservation camps and how he like had this like very sad upbringing. And for me, I was thinking about it. I was like, that's where for me my knowledge about Native Americans and Indigenous people's stories end. For me, it's like I know about a lot of their women are like going missing, like going through violence. Like I know like this is what is happening, and that's where my knowledge about it ends. And I was thinking the other day, I was like, what does their resistance look like? Like, what are they still fighting? Like, do they still exist? Like, what are there any reservation camps like living like existing near me? Like, why does like my knowledge of them end there from high school? And like hearing this talk and hearing about like the like invisibility of like Indigenous people, their fight and how like you guys are in the UN and like making like fighting for this. Like, thank you for like telling us about this, because for me, my knowledge ended up with that. But my question goes into, you mentioned in your presentation about structures of care, and I'm very curious. I wanted you to go more into it and like what that looks like and how we can include more of it into our societies. Specifically, for me, I'm more interested in like the resistance and like the what's it called, about the resistance of Black people, the liberation of Black people. But like I'm just so curious about the structures of care. Like have you seen it, where you've seen it, what that looks like? And I'm very curious about it. But thank you again.
I think we'll have time for maybe one more question before. Oh yes, see a couple over here. And actually, please introduce yourself before you speak. That would be wonderful.
Hi, my name is Andres. I'm a third-year biochemistry undergraduate student. And as an Otomi from Jilotepec, Estado de Mexico, I have personally seen how the loss of land leads directly to the loss of language and traditional ecological knowledge. When cartels or energy companies displace a community, they aren't just moving people, they are erasing a database of biodiversity knowledge. And so how do we convince international human rights bodies and that cultural erasure should be prosecuted with the same weight as physical violence? And not only that, I wanted to ask, in your personal experience, what forms of indigenous resistance you've seen have been most effective in this?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Devon James. I'm a senior in labor studies and political science. And my question revolves around, you kind of mentioned earlier on how a lot of the work you're doing is meeting people where they're at. And I was curious as to, I guess, some more strategic side. Like, have you found like consciousness raising, like kind of critical pedagogy to be helpful in that? But also, as I mentioned, as someone who's involved heavily with organized labor, kind of workers' organizations or affinity organizations that also aid you in kind of one, bringing the issue to the forefront, but also building those bridges because they are a unified project.
I keep waiting for the microphone to be handed to me. I'm used to doing this in smaller spaces where we all share the microphone. Thank you so much for those questions. And also, like, I never know whenever I start a talk, like where I'm going to land in terms of like the energy in which I deliver my points. I like it when I'm more feeling more like the animation and the theory. So I'm so sorry for setting the tempo to be very like, kind of like monotone and calm, because this conversation, the things that we're dealing with, the things that we're fighting for, it fires me up so much. And so thank you for your questions, because it also helps to like know what people are sitting with and what comes top of mind as we're talking about this. But to start with you, obviously not an isolated experience, right? And not some sort of accident. Like that is the result of the structural erasure of Indigenous peoples. It's been long known, like what we stood for and what we fought for has always been in conflict with the agenda of the settler state. And so to legitimize and normalize those power structures and governance structures that were built off of that logic, by necessity, our histories, our people, and our ongoing realities continues to be to be erased because it informs that resistance. And an example of that is just the development of the democracy and the acknowledgement that it has roots in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And also what is never talked about in that is that Indigenous peoples immediately rejected that structure because it eliminated the element of women having leadership positions and being part of the decision making of an inclusive governance structure, of a real democracy. And that was the fundamental conflict between what's become the United States and why Indigenous peoples continued to carve out and maintain our resistance for our right to self-determination. And so it's effectively separated from our collective consciousness and from our understanding of how to get equity and how to improve our structure of democracy, these models of systems of care that we maintain in our communities. And so an example is that from everything from decision making and governance structures and how that is carried out is centered around ensuring that women have a equal place in that process. And in many cases, because we're matriarchal and matrilineal, that they are the ones that make those decisions. Because the logic is there's a deep connection with the power of bringing life and creating life with the realities and the gifts of the natural world and of Mother Earth. And so very simply, because women create life, because they become the ones that carry forward and make possible the perpetuation of our people, they're the ones most equipped to be able to decide how and why and when we defend our communities, how and why we use land, how and why we engage in development. And I say that just so that I can convey that simply, but it's actually more complex when we look at how those governance structures and systems of care get developed, because it is also rooted in an understanding that we all have these masculine and feminine wisdoms inside of us. And it's been the structure of heteronormative patriarchy that has conditioned people to not really understand that, and everyone suffers. Everyone suffers as a result of that structure. Even though like it's been structured to privilege the power of men, men also suffer under structures of toxic masculinity and patriarchy because it limits how we express ourselves and how we find our purpose. With an intention to serve state and to serve corporate interests. And to me, it's so insane. And I know it's hard to like really convey the fundamental insanity of that because it's so normalized. But all our purpose is in finding our gifts and the medicines that we have that make us like light up and feel like our life means something. And I can guarantee you that there's so many different examples among Indigenous communities where that was never rooted in joining the military, or developing a military, or being a CEO of a corporation. It was rooted in the ways and the opportunities of you discovering what is the gift and the ways that you provide and protect for the people around you and the things that you love. And that's a responsibility carried out with both men and women, and all the genders that exist. And so, like to give a more conscious example, and to kind of segue into your question about loss of land, loss of language, and loss of heritage. Yes, that has always been a connection that we've been bringing to, especially in the framework on the conservation of biological diversity, because data shows that Indigenous peoples have been very successful in maintaining and protecting biodiversity. And they're like, oh, why? How is that? How has that been? And it comes down to our ability to preserve those lifeways, those language systems, and the ceremonial structures that are a part of it. Because being rooted in that is what gives us the foundation to then build these systems and structures of care, right? And so an example is, I guess I'll speak generally because I'm trying to weave together 3 different examples that exist on this side of the coast, but also in Hawaii and in Alaska, and the restoration of food systems. People recognizing that our inability to feed ourselves is because of the assimilation into these capitalist models of economy where food has become unaffordable and inaccessible, and the loss of land and the loss of access to land has prevented people's ability to live off of the land. And so the response to that and the entry point to restoring that relationship has been first in reclaiming culture and language, then in reclaiming in that process access to land, and then in reclaiming the ability to work with that land and to restore our responsibility with that land. And that has fundamentally led in many different places and ecosystems to taking the responsibility to restore the ecosystem and to create climate resilient, ecologically sustainable, and nutrient rich food systems. And in that process, bringing together the youth, the elders, the women, the men, and restoring that responsibility and sharing that knowledge with each other. And in that, utilizing and engaging in that, not as a profit-driven motive or something that's going to eventually get us into the market, but with this simple commitment to want to feed each other and to make sure that that food is healthy and good for us. And in there, it just starts to ripple out, like the benefits of that. And so it becomes a challenge in a lot of the Indigenous efforts to restore these practices and maintain these practices, because we'll have funders being like, well, what is the impact? But they're looking at it in terms of numbers. They want to know the yield of what's being produced and how much you got for it when you took it to sale as the primary indicator. But the indicators that we use is that more children are growing up with their traditional foods, that we are bringing back sacred plants and medicines that have been missing and that have been overcultivated, polluted, or otherwise prevented from propagating in the ecosystem from which it's from. And that in doing this, we brought back community joy, ceremony, like community spaces where our elders are being taken care of, and practices where we are taking care of our most vulnerable first and foremost, and we're improving the quality of life of our people. You can't really measure that with the way that the system has conditioned us to look at progress and value that progress. And so, yeah, to go to you, so much of the movement and the advances that were made during the civil rights era, particularly in the American Indian movement, has been based on recognizing that during that time, we had to understand our resistance and our battles as an intellectual battle. Like, we are still fighting old wars. We're still dealing with the legacy of colonization and all of its impacts and structures and systems. But those old wars manifest itself in new ways. And during that era, our resistance was outright, first physical, then it was reactionary, trying to protect our treaty rights, and then it became intellectual. And in that intellectual movement, we get the development of frameworks, language, analyses that were so critical for us deepening our strategies and our understanding of what it is that we are fighting against. But we can't just live there, right? We can't just live in that way. We have to transform that knowledge into action. We have to also become practitioners of these values and understand how to translate this new understanding into effective action that invites everyone in to be part of that awakening and to be part of that restoration of the whole. And I think that's where we are now. Like, now we have enough of our history, of our collective history of understanding how we've all suffered in various ways under these oppressive structures, how we all continue to be disadvantaged and challenged in finding success and achieving prosperity, well-being, and health under these structures. And there's different forms of resistance that have been carried out by different pockets of people. Everything from abolitionists, anti-war, racial equity, gender equity, and now Indigenous rights can be brought together to learn and analyze and rethink what are the strategies that we can employ now as we move forward. What are the new pedagogies that we need to develop that further our advancement out of this cycle of violence? And we're at the cusp of it. And we can do that ourselves, or we can just allow and accept that everyone's going to rely on ChatGPT to figure it out for us. And one of the things, as we talk about like these threats that AI has been bringing to our communities, and like just the different ways people have been using it, both to revitalize monsters that we thought were dead and conquered, such as like uranium mining in our territories. Our elders have constantly regrounded us. I mean, they get overwhelmed when we're talking about all the technology and whatnot, but they reground us in fundamental truths. And one of the things that I've liked recently is grandmother Marion Lyons, who's Anishinaabe. In this discussion, I think it was at last year's COP, where we were seeing everywhere all of this promotion for AI for climate, AI for good. AI is like the future for the advancement, evolution of humanity. Like we were making jokes about how now Indigenous peoples aren't going to be allowed in those spaces at all because they're going to have their AI avatars like talking to people. to inform people about like our life ways and what we're doing. And our grandmother Mary Lyons like interrupted our spiraling and our doomsday scenarios with just being a simple question like, does AI have a heartbeat? Like, don't forget that a large part of our wisdom and our power comes not from our brains, but from the connection of our brains to our hearts. And so there's a difference, a fundamental difference. Like, first of all, what we're calling AI is not really artificial intelligence the way that, people are assuming and trying to pretend that it is. It's still a program that has its own inherent biases of its developers. But there's a difference between synthesizing information and generating knowledge. And the generation of knowledge, especially collective knowledge, happens with each other. Happens by bringing in not just what we think we know and the information and facts, but what we feel, what we experience, and what we like the ways that informs our consciousness. And I mean, we already know that there's no way and no structure right now that can enable AI to develop that type of complex process and that complex thinking. And so we're still at an advantage. And I think that the challenge with and the invitation to create new pedagogies right now is to speak to those dynamics and those differences and those challenges now.
I think we have time for one more short question and short answer. We have a question here from Cecilia Alonso. How can I be a good ally to this movement in my day-to-day life?
We get this question a lot. And I feel like I've had different answers in different stages of my life. And now I'm well into my auntie stage, which I love. It starts at home. It really starts at home. And it starts about what you're passionate about. I feel like we don't have to learn new passions. We don't have to start caring about new things. I fundamentally believe that whatever you carry right now in your work, in your life, whatever has motivated and guided you to be in whatever position that you are professionally, personally, it has a value and a gift and a medicine that is needed right now. So starting with where you're at right now and looking at what are the issues affecting your water? What are the issues affecting your air? Who is mobilizing against that? And just following that thread of inquiry and taking and stepping into that responsibility to be one of those people who are fighting and for the protection of the sacred. that will lead you into being an effective accomplice for Indigenous peoples, and will probably lead you into the spaces where we're already operating. And it will lead you there in a way where you're honoring your own humanity so that we can operate from a place of equality and not from any type of savior mentality or any type of fetishization of Indigenous values and principles. Like fundamentally, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a battle to protect and restore our own humanity. And in that, restoring our consciousness and rerouting our strategies and our visions for our future and our responsibility to Mother Earth. And I think that that's powerful. And it's going to be a power and a collective opportunity that will never, ever be fully taken away from us.
Please join me in giving Janene Yazzie another thank you for this illuminating talk.
I'm not going to hear.
If you want to watch again or tell your friends, the video recording will be available online on the Consortium's website and YouTube channel, and the recordings from the other 5 talks in this year's series, as well as many of our past speaker events, can also be found there. And as a reminder, we'd be grateful if you could take a couple of minutes to fill out the feedback form. The QR code is on the screen. And once again, thank you to Janene, and thank you all for joining us.